There is a language carved into hundreds of surviving inscriptions that modern scholars can pronounce perfectly and still cannot fully translate. It uses an alphabet borrowed from the Greeks. It shares no meaningful grammar with any other language family in Europe. For over 2,000 years, it has sat in the historical record like a locked door. Visible, tantalizing, and sealed. That language belonged to the Etruscans. And for just as long, the question of who they actually were sat locked behind that same door. Ancient DNA finally opened it. What was inside was not what anyone expected. For most of recorded history, the Etruscans occupied a strange, half-mythical place in the story of ancient Italy. Everyone agreed they mattered. Rome's earliest kings may have been Etruscan. Roman religion borrowed its divination practices directly from Etruscan priests. Roman engineering, the arch, the sewer system, the very layout of cities, carried Etruscan fingerprints. The alphabet the Romans used to write Latin came through Etruscan hands from the Greeks. By the time Rome became an empire, the civilization that shaped its foundations had already been absorbed, its language dying, its cities swallowed into the Roman state. But where had they come from in the first place? The ancient world itself couldn't agree. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, gave the answer that stuck for the next 2,500 years. The Etruscans, he claimed, were originally Lydians, a people from western Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. According to his account, a famine so severe struck the Lydian kingdom that half the population, under the leadership of a prince named Tyrannus, built ships and sailed west to find a new home. They landed in central Italy and became the Etruscans, whose Roman name, Tyrrhenians, still echoes in the Tyrrhenian Sea that Italy's western coast opens onto today. It was a good story. It explained the exotic non-Indo-European language. It explained the culture's distinctive art, which showed clear Eastern Mediterranean influence. It explained why the Etruscans always felt different from their Italic neighbors, the Latins and Umbrians and Oscans who spoke recognizably related Indo-European tongues. But even in antiquity, not everyone bought it. The Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing centuries after Herodotus, flatly rejected the Lydian migration story. He argued the Etruscans were indigenous to Italy, a native population, distinct from their neighbors, but native nonetheless. He pointed out that the Lydians themselves, by his own era, had no memory of ever sending colonists west, and that Etruscan customs, language, and religious practices bore no meaningful resemblance to anything documented in Anatolia. Two respected ancient authorities. Two contradictory origin stories. For the next 2,000 years, historians simply had to pick a side, because the evidence available, language, art, scattered anecdote, could support either narrative depending on how you weighted it. Modern archaeology added a third option in the 20th century. The Etruscans weren't migrants at all in any meaningful biological sense, but represented a direct, unbroken cultural evolution from the indigenous Villanovan culture already occupying the same territory for centuries. Continuity, not migration. A native people who had always been there. By the early 2000s, this was where the argument stood. 3 explanations, no resolution, and a 2,500-year-old historical dispute that no amount of pottery analysis or linguistic comparison seemed able to settle. Then geneticists got their hands on the bones. The first serious genetic investigations into Etruscan origins began in the 2000s and 2010s, working with the limited mitochondrial DNA techniques available at the time. The results were frustratingly ambiguous. Some studies found signals suggesting Near Eastern ancestry, seeming to support Herodotus. Others found the opposite. The sample sizes were small, the DNA degraded, the statistical power weak. The X problem, so to speak, remained unsolved. The breakthrough came in 2021 with a study published in Science Advances led by researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and the University of Florence. This was not a handful of degraded samples. It was a comprehensive analysis of 82 ancient individuals, drawn from sites spanning a staggering time frame. From before 800 BCE, when Etruscan civilization was crystallizing out of its Villanovan roots, through to the Roman imperial period, well after Etruscan language and identity had been absorbed into Rome. This was the first study with the statistical power and the time depth to actually answer the question. And the answer surprised almost everyone. Genetically, the Etruscans were not migrants from Anatolia. They showed no significant genetic signal connecting them to Lydia, or to Western Anatolia, or to the Eastern Mediterranean at all, beyond what any Italian population of the period would carry through the normal, diffuse currents of Bronze and Iron Age contact. Their genetic profile was overwhelmingly similar to that of their Latin-speaking, Indo-European-speaking neighbors in the rest of central Italy. Herodotus, on the core biological question, appeared to be wrong. This should have settled things in favor of Dionysius. A native population, continuous with the Villanovan culture that preceded it, was exactly what the indigenous origin theory had always argued. But the story did not stop there. And this is where it gets genuinely strange. Because if the Etruscans were genetically almost indistinguishable from their Latin, Umbrian, and Faliscan neighbors, populations who spoke Indo-European languages descended from the same broad linguistic family as Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and eventually English. Then a question emerges that the genetics themselves cannot answer, and that has haunted linguists for over a century. Why did the Etruscans speak a language that isn't Indo-European at all? This is the detail that makes the Etruscan case one of the strangest in the entire field of historical linguistics. Etruscan is what scholars call a language isolate, or more precisely, part of a tiny family called Tersenian that includes only Etruscan itself and two poorly attested relatives, Rhaetic in the Alps and Lemnian on the Greek island of Lemnos. It shares no demonstrable common ancestor with Latin, Greek, Celtic, Germanic, or any of the dozens of other branches that make up the vast Indo-European family tree. The family that, by the Iron Age, had already spread across nearly the entire European landmass surrounding the Etruscans on every side. Every neighboring population, the Latins to the south, the Umbrians to the east, the Celtic Gauls pressing down from the north, spoke Indo-European tongues. The Etruscans, sitting in the middle of all of them, on a stretch of coast that the genetics say they had inhabited for as long as anyone could trace, spoke something else entirely. Something whose roots reach back to a linguistic world that had mostly vanished from the rest of Europe before recorded history even began. The genetic study did not resolve this. If anything, it deepened the mystery because it eliminated the easiest explanation. A recent migration from Anatolia would have neatly explained a non-Indo-European language arriving with a non-Indo-European population. Instead, the DNA insists the population was local, which means the language was local too. An ancient survivor, a fragment of the linguistic landscape of Europe before the Indo-European expansion swept across the continent starting around 5,000 years ago, somehow preserved in a single, contiguous population sitting on the Italian peninsula while everyone around them adopted the newer tongues arriving from the east. The Etruscans, in other words, may represent one of the last surviving voices of a Europe that existed before Indo-European speakers ever arrived. Not visitors from Anatolia. Something closer to a linguistic fossil. A population who kept speaking what everyone around them had already abandoned. There is a further layer the 2021 study revealed, and it concerns not where the Etruscans came from, but what happened to them once Rome absorbed their territory. By tracking genetic ancestry across the full time span of the study, from the pre-Roman Iron Age through the centuries of the Roman Republic and into the imperial period, researchers found that the Etruscan region underwent a dramatic demographic transformation, but not during the period most people would expect. The genetic shift wasn't concentrated at the moment of Roman conquest in the 3rd century BCE. It intensified afterward during the imperial period, when the ancient DNA record shows substantial new ancestry entering the population from the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. The genetic signature of an empire in full operation, moving people, slaves, soldiers, and merchants across thousands of miles of connected territory. The population that had remained remarkably stable and locally rooted for well over 1,000 years, through the entire rise and fall of Etruscan civilization as a political and linguistic entity, was transformed more thoroughly by 3 centuries of Roman imperial integration than by any event in its own long independent history. This matters because it reframes what actually erased the Etruscans. It wasn't conquest in any simple military sense. The genetic data shows no sharp demographic break at the point of Roman annexation. What erased them was something slower and less dramatic. Centuries of integration into an empire so vast and so interconnected that it dissolved regional distinctiveness across the entire Italian peninsula, Etruscan territory included. The language died first, replaced by Latin as Etruscan elites assimilated into Roman political life. The genetic distinctiveness eroded later, as the empire's circulatory system of trade and slavery and military service mixed populations at a scale no earlier period in Italian history had ever achieved. Consider what this means when you put the 2 findings side by side. The Etruscans were not outsiders. Herodotus's famine-stricken Lydian refugees, sailing west under Prince Tyrannus, do not appear in the genetic record in any meaningful way. The population that built Tarquinia and Cerveteri and Veii, that filled painted tombs with banquets and dancers, that gave Rome its earliest kings and its alphabet and its religious calendar, was substantially the same population that had been living in that stretch of central Italy since well before anyone wrote anything down. And yet, they spoke a language that connects to nothing else nearby. A population as local as any in ancient Italy, carrying a linguistic inheritance that made them, in a real sense, foreigners in their own unbroken homeland. Not because they had traveled from somewhere else, but because almost everyone around them had adopted something new, while the Etruscans, for reasons the DNA cannot explain, had not. This is the twist that ancient DNA delivered. And it is stranger than either of the 2 theories the ancient world argued about for 2,500 years. Not migration. Not simple continuity either, in the sense Dionysius meant it. Because continuity of population doesn't explain linguistic isolation this extreme. Something closer to a preserved fragment. A population that stayed physically put while the linguistic map of an entire continent transformed around them, generation after generation, until they were the only ones left speaking what may be one of Europe's oldest surviving tongues. The Etruscan question was never really a question about ships and famines and princes named Tyrannus. It was a question about how much a population can change on the outside: language, religion, political fortune, while remaining, underneath all of it, remarkably the same people who were already there. Ancient DNA answered the biological half of that question with unusual clarity. 82 individuals, spanning nearly 1,000 years, told researchers something Herodotus and Dionysius could never have settled through argument alone. The Etruscans were Italy's own, not Anatolia's export. But, in solving that half of the mystery, the science handed linguists an even deeper one. A language with no family, sitting in the mouths of a population with deep local roots, refusing every neat explanation historians have offered for it since the 5th century BCE. The tombs are still being excavated. The inscriptions are still being read, one fragmentary word at a time, by scholars who can pronounce every syllable and still cannot always say what it meant. Somewhere in that gap between what the bones say and what the words say, the real story of the Etruscans is still waiting. The DNA solved one mystery. It may have only just uncovered the deeper one.